For nearly 2,500 years, a powerful succession of imperial dynasties ruled the vast Persian lands, beginning as early as 600 years before the Common Era. At the heart of this mighty empire was the land we now know as modern-day Iran. Across the centuries, 5 major dynasties rose to power, each one shaping, expanding, and enforcing the legacy of Persia through might, intellect, and fear. The first of these dynasties was the legendary Achaemenid Empire, led by the iconic Cyrus the Great. Cyrus conquered vast regions, including the powerful civilizations of the Babylonians, Lydians, and Medians, bringing them under the banner of Persia. At its peak, this empire ruled over much of the ancient Middle East, commanding lands that stretched farther than any had before. This was the birth of the First Persian Empire, a reign of unmatched scale, until it eventually fell to the relentless march of Alexander the Great. At the ceremonial heart of the empire stood the magnificent city of Persepolis, a masterpiece of Persian architecture, culture, and political power. Though kings held supreme authority, the empire's complex legal system was carried out by numerous state governments, each enforcing the law across far-reaching provinces. Remarkably, the First Persian Empire, and many dynasties that followed, rejected slavery as a general practice, a stance incredibly rare for that time and region. Slaves were usually only taken as prisoners of war, and even that was limited. In a historic move, Persian kings even freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity, earning the admiration of many across ancient lands. The Persian Empire, and the dynasties that followed, did more than conquer. They contributed profoundly to art, science, architecture, and astronomy, shaping not just the ancient world, but the future of civilization itself. Writing in the 5th century BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus observed something unusual about Persian society. Children were raised to value honesty above all else. In fact, lying wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as the greatest sin, worthy of death. In Persia, to tell a lie was to challenge the very moral order of the empire, and those who did paid the ultimate price. But lying was only one of many offenses that could lead to a slow and excruciating death. Those condemned by Persian law weren't just executed, they were made to suffer for days, enduring unthinkable agony, before death finally came as a twisted form of relief. In this journey, we'll uncover the most brutal crimes and punishments handed down through the 5 dynasties of the Persian Empire, each more fearsome and inventive than the last. In the Persian language, the word for punishment literally meant to question. In a society where even a single lie could lead to death, interrogation and execution were often one and the same. Torture wasn't just a method of extracting truth, it became a deadly ritual designed to break the body while exposing the soul. The Persians devised countless horrific methods to torment those found guilty, or even suspected of crimes. While lying was a key offense, it was hardly the only one that carried violent, often fatal consequences. No crime went unpunished, and no punishment was mild. Even lesser crimes carried harsh, lifelong consequences. Punishments often left criminals visibly marked, making them easy to identify in public. A thief might lose his hands. A follower of liars could have his ears sliced off. Other offenses, amputation of the feet, leaving the accused permanently broken and shamed. In some cases, blinding was used as punishment, metal pins driven into the eyes of the condemned. And it wasn't just thieves who suffered amputations, even beggars could have their hands cut off on the whim of a village judge. Another brutal method was whipping, referred to as striping. Each lash was counted as a separate punishment, and sentences could reach a staggering 10,000 stripes. These beatings were so extreme, they had to be spread over multiple days, with several executioners taking turns. No single man could inflict that level of pain alone. Some unfortunate souls were flayed alive, their skin peeled away in strips as they screamed in agony. During the First Persian Empire, it was common for condemned criminals to be tortured multiple times before finally being executed. Death was never swift. Pain was the point. In particularly severe capital crimes, the sequence of punishment was cruelly methodical. First, the eyes were destroyed, blinding the victim. Then they were stripped of clothing and dignity. Finally, they were flayed alive, dying slowly, as their flesh was torn from their body. In some executions, the flaying process was deliberately slow, the skin removed in strips, maximizing the agony. Each tear of flesh brought unbearable pain, stretching the moment of death across hours. Other times, the entire skin was removed at once, a quicker, yet still monstrous process. Modern scholars believe that in both cases, death was usually the result of heart failure, triggered by shock and trauma too great to endure. Sometimes, the punishment was even more twisted. The executioners would only cut away a few strips of skin, leaving the victim alive, bleeding, exposed and vulnerable. There was no mercy, only delay. Many died, not from the cuts themselves, but from infection or exposure, left to slowly wither in agony. Flaying was not uniquely Persian. The Babylonians and Assyrians, the brutal powers that came before, also used this horrific method, but Persia would take it to new levels of cruelty and symbolism. Records from magistrates in the farthest reaches of the Achaemenid Empire mentioned flaying as an established punishment. It wasn't a rumor, it was law, policy, procedure. In one of the empire's most infamous acts of symbolic justice, a corrupt judge was executed by flaying. But the horror didn't stop there. His skin was used to upholster the judicial chair, the very seat his own son would now occupy. Every ruling, every decision, would be made while seated on the flayed remains of his disgraced father. With each case he judged, the son was forced to remember, this is what happens to those who let greed outweigh justice. The message was chillingly clear: betray the law, and the law will strip you to the bone. The phrase ashes to ashes carried an entirely different meaning in ancient Persia. Here, ashes didn't bury the dead, they created them. For thieves and traitors, death by ashes came in ways that today seem almost unimaginably cruel. In one such punishment, a prisoner was locked inside a room filled with deep ash. They had to remain standing, no food, no water, until exhaustion forced them to fall. Once they collapsed, they began to inhale the fine dust. Day after day, breath after painful breath, the ash filled their lungs, until they suffocated in silence. Denied nourishment, denied mercy, the condemned often perished from a cruel combination of hunger and suffocation. Their final breaths weren't air, they were ash. A second, even more disturbing method is mentioned in both the Bible's Book of 2 Maccabees and in the writings of Valerius Maximus, a Roman historian from the time of Emperor Tiberius. This was no myth, it was recorded history. In this version, the victim was thrown into a tall chamber partially filled with ash. On the outside, executioners turned a system of wheels and paddles, stirring the ash inside. With every turn, the air thickened. The condemned could do nothing but breathe in the swirling dust, slowly choking on it. Some died from suffocation, others from panic-induced heart failure. No matter the cause, the end was slow, terrifying, and inescapable. Around 162 BCE, this method was reportedly used to execute Menelaus, the Jewish high priest of Jerusalem. His crime, plotting rebellion. In Persian law, ashes were not for petty criminals, they were reserved for traitors, insurrectionists, and enemies of the state. And Menelaus, in the eyes of Persia, was all three. Milk and honey, symbols of abundance in many cultures, were used by the Persians for something far more grotesque, a method of execution that stretched across days, sometimes even weeks. In the book of Exodus, the land of Israel was called a place flowing with milk and honey, a symbol of divine blessing and fertility. But in Persia, these same substances were used to create one of the most disturbing death sentences in recorded history. The Persians twisted this sweetness into suffering, transforming milk and honey into weapons of degradation, disease, and decay. It began with force feeding. The prisoner was made to drink milk and honey, not for nourishment, but to induce violent diarrhea. Then they were placed inside a hollowed log or boat, their head, arms and legs left exposed, while another vessel was sealed on top, trapping the rest of their body inside. To ensure their suffering would attract every pest imaginable, more milk and honey was smeared over the prisoner's exposed skin. Then the vessel was set afloat on a still pond or marsh, where insects rot, and the sun would complete the punishment. The milk and honey they had swallowed caused severe diarrhea, leaving them sitting in their own waste, a perfect breeding ground for insects. Flies biting bugs and maggots swarmed their exposed flesh, slowly devouring them alive. Maggots would hatch inside the open wounds, writhing beneath the skin, feeding on living tissue. The body would begin to decay, while the person was still conscious, still breathing. Death came only after total breakdown, a mercy delivered far too late. Submerged in their own urine and feces, the victim's body became a paradise for parasites. With no way to move or defend themselves, they were left to be consumed alive, inside and out. This horrifying practice is now known as Scaphism. Some ancient sources insist it was real, but modern scholars remain divided, unsure if it was truth or terrorizing myth. Still, the vivid detail of these accounts suggests that someone, somewhere, believed this was possible. If Scaphism did occur, septic shock, from infections and internal decay, would likely have been the true cause of death, but not before the victim experienced days of misery, filth, and torture. There is chilling evidence that the Persians buried people alive, not metaphorically, but quite literally. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, during Xerxes' campaign in Greece, victims were buried head first, their bodies inverted into the soil, suffocating in silence. In one case, 19 Greek boys and girls were sent to the town of Tum, where Persian royal doctors buried them alive. This wasn't punishment for a crime, it was a religious ritual, an offering to ancient gods before battle, a horrifying form of spiritual diplomacy. Herodotus also tells of King Cambyses, who ordered 12 Persian noblemen to be buried alive. There was no crime, no trial, no reason, just a king's whim, a terrifying reminder that royalty did not answer to logic, only to power. Historians speculated that Cambyses had gone mad, a belief strengthened by multiple disturbing accounts of his rule. But madness in a king's mind was no shield for his victims. Herodotus further recounts that Queen Amestris, wife of Xerxes, once ordered the burial of living children, royalty, no less, as a sacrifice to the gods of the earth, in gratitude for her long life. These weren't criminals, they were offerings, breathing, screaming, royal offerings. 14 children, all of Persian royal blood, were buried head first into the dirt, still alive. A brutal, blood-soaked prayer for divine favor. It must be noted, Herodotus is the sole ancient source who described this terrifying practice of live burial. There are no other surviving records to confirm it. Because Herodotus gave no sources, modern historians remain divided, unsure whether these events are fact or folklore, though many ancient writers believe them to be true. Whether real or exaggerated, the fear they inspired was very much alive. And then, there was the fire punishment. Some accounts say Queen Persisatis, wife of Darius II, ordered molten metal poured into the ears, or eyes of those she accused of lying. Liquid metal as justice, searing out deceit with unbearable heat. Ancient Zoroastrian texts referenced molten metal, not just as a punishment, but as a test of the soul's purity. If the person was innocent, the fire would not harm them. But if they had lied, or believed lies, the metal would burn through flesh and spirit alike. Modern scholars doubt the literal truth of Queen Persisatis's molten punishments. Still, many believe the Persians did use molten metals, including gold, to punish or kill criminals, particularly those of noble status. One enduring legend tells of King Shapur I, who captured Roman Emperor Valerian and used him as a human footstool. According to Roman writers, Shapur later poured molten gold down Valerian's throat,
a chilling punishment for imperial pride. Whether real or invented, the story cemented Persia's image as master of fearsome execution. The tale goes further. After months in captivity, Shapur killed Valerian by force-feeding him molten gold, then had the emperor's body stuffed and put on display, a brutal warning to Rome and the world. Wealth consumed him, ego destroyed him. Persia watched. But many historians believe the story was pure Roman propaganda. In truth, Valerian and his troops were likely kept alive to work on engineering projects, including the construction of Caesar's dam near Shapur. They were eventually released, without gold, without flames, and without the legend, until Rome gave it one. One bizarre form of execution linked to ancient Persia involves the use of trees, a method often retold, yet lacking solid evidence. A British magazine in the 1800s claimed that Persian kings would hang thieves from trees, turning orchards and roadsides into grim warnings. But aside from hearsay and speculation, historical proof is scarce. According to volume 34 of the British Register, the Persian king supposedly ordered these executions personally, boasting a zero-tolerance policy. "Let no crook go free," the account claimed. But again, the evidence lies in stories, not official Persian records. In truth, Persian legal codes didn't emphasize hanging thieves from trees. They were far more likely to amputate the hands of robbers, a clear permanent mark of their crime. Still, the British Register described a method so brutal, it sounds fictional. 2 tree trunks were bent toward each other and tied with ropes. The criminal's arms and legs were then fastened to each tree. When the ropes were cut, snap, the trees recoiled violently, tearing the thief's body apart, splitting him in 2. The severed body parts were then displayed, hung from trees lining major roads. Travelers couldn't miss them. These grisly ornaments served as a haunting deterrent to anyone thinking of stealing along Persian trade routes. Though the tale has been widely repeated, it most likely originated with James Moria, a British diplomat, who wrote about his visit with the Persian king in 1808. He recorded it in the British Register, but without Persian confirmation, it remains legend, not verified history. Stoning was one punishment that Persia undeniably practiced. Referenced in the Old Testament, New Testament, and by writers like Josephus and Herodotus, stoning was a long-standing method of execution, and tragically, one that still survives in some parts of the world today. Biblical accounts describe the condemned being struck repeatedly with stones until death. But in Persia, heavy stones served additional roles. They were used during interrogation, or placed on the body of the guilty, until bones broke and breath collapsed. One such method involved placing large stones on a victim's chest. With each added rock, the weight increased, and slowly, the person's lungs compressed, forcing out their final breath under unbearable pressure. Centuries later, a similar method resurfaced during the Salem witch trials in colonial America, proving that crushing people under stones was not exclusive to Persia, but a timeless tool of fear and superstition. In another variation, the condemned was simply bludgeoned in the skull with large stones. This form of execution was often reserved for servants, peasants, and the lowest social classes, who could be stoned not only for their own crimes, but sometimes for the crimes committed by the nobles they served. Targeting nobles was risky. Many were interconnected through blood or marriage, and punishing one could provoke the wrath of an entire lineage, making justice a dangerous game. Yet Persian justice did not always shy away. In multiple instances, it even extended to members of the king's own family, proving that no one, not even royalty, was fully beyond the reach of the blade or the stone. Those who rebelled against the Persian Empire didn't die quietly. Their punishment was slow, public, and humiliating. They were first marked, disfigured, so that anyone could recognize their treachery at a glance. Then they were placed where all could see, and all could torment. The branding of shame often involved cutting off the nose, ears, or both. In some cases, the rebels were permanently crippled, unable to flee or fight again. Afterward, they were paraded through their own city, a walking symbol of disgrace, before being chained to the gates of a local judge or government official, left as a living warning to all. The worst offenders were sent directly to the king, not for mercy, but for spectacle. There they were tortured while shackled to palace gates, beaten and humiliated, until they succumbed to death itself. In a chilling twist, loyal subjects were encouraged to demonstrate their devotion not by kindness, but by cruelty. They were expected to torment these chained prisoners, physically and psychologically, as a sign of allegiance to the throne. Sometimes kindness was weaponized. Loyal citizens would offer food or water, not out of mercy, but to prolong the suffering. Then moments later, they would beat the prisoner with sticks, cut their skin, or kick their broken bodies, ensuring their torment lasted longer. Chained victims suffered until their bodies failed them completely. They rarely got a second chance, but in a cruel twist of fate, some who came close to death were rescued, nursed back to health, only to be chained and tortured all over again. The punishment was not just a sentence, it was a cycle. The Persians also embraced one of the most brutal punishments in ancient history, crucifixion. While the Romans would later become infamous for it, Persians used it centuries earlier, and with equal cruelty. Persian crucifixion was typically less about nails and more about ropes and positioning. The victim was often tied to a vertical beam, their arms stretched above their head, slowly suffocating under the weight of their own body. Unlike the Roman cross, Persian crucifixion often involved a single upright pole. The hands were fastened high together, forcing the body into a posture of maximum pain and slow-motion death. It was not only a death sentence, it was a spectacle of shame. The very word excruciating comes from the Latin ex cruci, from the cross, a testament to just how agonizing this form of execution truly was. Victims sometimes clung to life for days, enduring hunger, thirst, and humiliation. But even in death, the punishment continued. Corpses were left hanging, exposed to animals, rain, and wind, a rotting warning for all who passed by. Persians weren't alone in their brutality. Mesopotamians, Greeks, Assyrians, Israelites, Carthaginians, and Romans all practiced crucifixion, reserving it for the most condemned souls. Even those who died by other means, rebels, traitors, thieves, were sometimes crucified post-mortem, their bodies hoisted in public squares rather than given burial or fire. Honor was denied, their punishment lived on. Take Polycrates of Samos, for example. Executed by the Persians, his body was displayed on a cross, left to rot in public until nature reclaimed it, bone by bone. The Persians didn't just kill the body once. In their mythology, a criminal could be executed twice, once in life, and once in the afterlife. Persian folklore included rich, vivid descriptions of judgment after death, and even prophecies of the world's final destruction. In their spiritual beliefs, reaching heaven meant crossing a bridge. For the virtuous, it was wide and safe. But for the wicked, it narrowed into a razor-sharp edge, a single misstep sending them plunging into hell. Every punishment in life was a preparation or a condemnation for what came after. Executions were sometimes ritualized, carefully timed, so that the criminal wouldn't just suffer on earth, but also face eternal torment in the hereafter. They weren't just killing the man, they were sealing his fate for all time. In Persian mythology, death was governed by the gods, and on earth, Persian executioners mirrored that divine control, torturing victims nearly to death, only to revive them and continue the suffering later. It was torture with intermissions, not mercy. This required incredible skill from Persian executioners. If a victim died too soon, before the appointed rounds of agony were completed, the executioner himself could face torture or death. Pain had to be managed professionally. Among the most terrifying Persian punishments was impalement, an execution method so brutal it echoed through history. Driving a human body onto a sharpened stake and planting it into the earth wasn't just reserved for Persia, it haunted Europe well into the 16th century and beyond. Herodotus wrote that when King Darius conquered Babylon, he had over 3,000 men impaled. This wasn't mere rumor. Darius's own inscriptions support the act. Thousands lifted on poles, left to die publicly. Biblical accounts of Haman, a Persian official, and his 10 sons, are ambiguous. Some translations say they were hanged, others impaled. But regardless of the debate, history confirms Persians frequently used impalement as a formal execution. What made impalement especially terrifying was how minor the crime could be. Lying in business, considered theft, could earn this gruesome fate. Even small offenses, by today's standards, could lead to a stake in the earth and a slow, merciless death. Sometimes, the method of impalement was chosen based on how long the criminal should suffer. Judges and witnesses helped determine the most fitting approach. The condemned had no say in the outcome, only a long wait for death. Every form of impalement was carried out in public view. The victim wasn't just in agony, they were on display, watched and judged, sometimes for 2 days or more, as they died in shame. Longitudinal impalement, favored for prolonged torture, began with the victim face down on a stone slab. A precise incision was made near the anus, marking the entrance point of a thick wooden stake. The wound was sealed with grease to reduce blood loss and allow a slower, more excruciating death. The stake was then driven deep into the body, angled toward the head, while assistants held the body still and hammered the weapon home. Executioners were trained to stop just short of the heart, dragging out the suffering. The stake itself was said to be as thick as a man's forearm, brutal in size and unforgiving in design. Despite the trauma of insertion, the real agony began when the stake was raised upright. Great care was taken to prevent the body's weight from sinking down too quickly, as that could bring death before the suffering was complete. Wooden stays and braces were used to keep the pole steady, often mounted in a gibbet, like those used in hangings. The grease prevented rapid blood loss, and the restraints ensured that the victim couldn't move, even if he wanted to end it himself. On rare occasions, if the victim's torment dragged on too long, the judge might show mercy, ordering the stake redirected so it pierced the chest and heart, granting a quicker death. But more often, the condemned was simply left to rot on the pole. A swifter method, transversal impalement, involved driving the stake horizontally through the torso, either front to back or vice versa. Death could come quickly or slowly, depending on what organs the stake passed through. To the Persians, horizontal impalement was seen as more humane, a paradox of mercy in a culture of horror. The victim usually died much faster, sparing the crowd and the condemned prolonged agony. Some claim that Persians used meat hooks and even other unspeakable tools for impalement, but history lacks evidence, and honestly, what they're confirmed to have done is horrific enough.